Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm your host, Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about global health and human rights. We're brought to you in partnership with the Bay Area Global Health Alliance, a network of academic institutions, companies from the biotech, tech and other sectors, NGOs and community organizations, all based in the San Francisco Bay Area and all committed to improving the health of people around the world. You can find out more about the Alliance at www.bayareaglobalhealth.org. Well, in this episode, we are going down and dirty with some of the messy, occasionally exalted, and all too often repugnant aspects of global pandemics, our own human attitudes to them. We're joined by Mark King, HIV activist, journalist, speaker, and creator of the hugely influential video blog, My Fabulous Disease, which you can find at marksking.com. Now, Mark and I are going to explore the conundrum of discrimination and stigma, which holds humanity back in so many ways. Mark, welcome to A Shot in the Arm.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a real honor to have you on the show. I've been hoping to have you as a guest for a very long time. Maybe I could start with a definition of stigma and discriminations that UNAIDS offered really over a decade ago. And as we use the term so frequently in relation to HIV, it might be worth just seeing if this makes sense. So they say that HIV-related stigma describes a process of devaluation of people either living with or associated with HIV. And the stigma often stems from the underlying stigmatization of sex and intravenous drug use, two of the primary routes of HIV infection. UNAIDS goes on to say that discrimination follows stigma and is the unfair and unjust treatment of an individual based on their real or perceived HIV status. The two, like two evil twin sisters, breach fundamental human rights and can occur at a number of different levels, including the political, the economic, the social, the legal, the psychological and institutional. So, Mark, does that sound about right to you as a definition?
Yes, it does sound about right. I mean, I keep things simple. And so my simple definition is stigma is how you view someone. Discrimination is how you treat someone. Obviously, there are overlaps there. And when you talk about the political, the legal, all of those things are usually action-oriented. That's discrimination. But of course, it is born out of stigma. It is born out of how we view people, how we tend to discredit them. And chief among them, people living with HIV, who we've always viewed as somehow damaged, untrustworthy, It's a lessening. Then it's a positioning people as the other.
Yeah, and the lesser. Yeah.
Yes.
So you're now having lived through two major pandemics, HIV and SARS-CoV-2. I guess I'm interested to know, what would you say are the differences and similarities between your experiences of the two?
You know, it's funny. At first, I was very offended by people comparing them at all.
Yeah.
Because of what we as people living with HIV had gone through the first time. I reserve the right to change my mind. I do it all the time. And in this case, I realized shortly thereafter that that's how we learn. That's how we learn. We compare and contrast as human beings, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that. So I don't mind the comparisons as much as I used to. The easy comparison for me, the way I put it, is that HIV is the nasty butt fucking cousin of COVID. Meaning COVID is going to affect your grandmother and people for whom society cares a lot. And HIV, by and large, affected those for whom society doesn't care all that much.
Yeah. I mean, I always used to describe HIV as Ebola in slow motion, or Ebola as HIV on acid. But COVID has, I think has changed the way we think about so many things. Does it gall you that it has taken us barely a year to develop a slate of effective vaccines. Okay, not treatments, but vaccines for COVID-19, while it took us 15 years to get some kind of effective treatment. And, the very first ARV triple therapies were not the easiest in the world. And, our HIV vaccine work is still way, way off. Do you think this can all be explained by the differences in knowledge about the two viruses and the advanced state of medical knowledge in 2021? Or do you think society just cares more in 2021?
Well, I say the easy answer. The answer that I want to go to in terms of instinctually is I want to say, yeah, they didn't care about HIV, God damn it, but as you are suggesting, they are two very different viruses. And that's the facts. And that is not to say that we were not slow out of the gate with HIV. We absolutely were. But I don't think that you can judge the swiftness of scientific breakthroughs between one virus and another, one, of course, being a retrovirus, so which we've never found a vaccine for. And so it's a little unfair to do that. Although I'm not a researcher and I'm not a clinician, you might be more in a position to challenge me on that. That being the case, it is true that we've learned things from HIV that have helped us in a broad way throughout all science. We changed a few things in terms of FDA approval and clinical trials, did we not? Which probably helped our research with COVID. But yeah, they're different viruses. Yes, I wish the science and public at large had gotten behind HIV. But I try to keep my anger in check. Because it is sometimes not a very good productive emotion, and as a drug addict in recovery, I got to be real careful in terms of where I invest my anger, But that may not be, and that may not be a very helpful emotion for an AIDS activist either, not to be slow to anger. But I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, maybe too often.
Well, I think with COVID and HIV, to some degree, you're right. It's apples and oranges, and we've certainly seen the lessons learnt in HIV being applied in future, in following epidemics. A little bit, say, when we decided to treat hepatitis, but certainly as we started understanding new zoonotic infections that were coming, like SARS and COVID. But one similarity that has struck me, and it's something I think we in the AIDS movement knew and have been passionately arguing about, and that is the terrible inequity of access to medical advances across the global south and the global north, and indeed within countries, especially the USA. So do you think we've learned anything there from the lessons of access to medicines? I mean, it depresses me so deeply that we're only now just seeing the first vaccinations in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and South Africa. I sort of feel that the global community should have known what to expect and been more aggressive, I think.
Talk about having to choose my anger carefully. This gets me angry. So thanks a lot, Ben. You're already putting me in that position. And you don't have to look any further, global South, you don't have to look any further than the American South to see infection rates and a complete breakdown of healthcare that rivals sub-Saharan Africa in terms of HIV. You look at the way we're treating COVID right now. We're all taking off our masks and going back to restaurants in Texas and Mississippi, two states that are in the top 5 of new infection rates and among the worst states when it comes to the new variants of COVID. So we haven't learned much in the United States. We are still driven, as always, from this misguided American exceptionalism, this misguided American freedom to do whatever we want, and old racism. And racism and the haves and the have-nots and the discrepancies between who has access to healthcare and prevention and who does not. And if you look at the demographic makeup of Texas and Mississippi, you pretty much have people who are white and privileged and have access to health care and have gotten their COVID shots, or they'll be the first in line, versus those who have not, who are going to get left behind. Let's all take off our masks. Everybody that matters is already covered. So we haven't learned a goddamn thing. We haven't gotten past Americans' original sin. We haven't gotten past what the hell to do about race, even after 2020. Because remember, even in a COVID lockdown, we all learned that Black Lives Matter, or that people learned it for the first time that weren't paying attention before, and still here we are. Here we are.
So I want to come back to the question of racial equity and equality, and I know those are two very different words with different meanings.
Yes,
but I want to come back to your history and how you think about your life. You're going to be embarrassed, or maybe you're not, but you are one of the most inspiring leaders in the AIDS response, certainly in the US, and I've rashly called you the Queen Mother of the US AIDS response.
But have you called me that publicly, Ben?
I'm afraid so.
Or is this a first?
No, sadly, this is a second. This is reinforcement.
Okay.
But it does speak to the role model that you've had for so many of us. You tested positive in 1985. You fought addiction. You just spoke about that. But you've built in the last decade an incredible package of social media and emerged as one of the most influential community leaders, speakers, and journalists. And I just really want to know, how did you do that?
Authenticity. The idea that when I got into this, I didn't want HIV to strip me away from who I was. I didn't want the HIV. Although I say I don't want to be defined by HIV, who am I kidding? I've got HIV tattooed on my forehead. I mean, that's who I am. That's who I present to the world. But I didn't want it to take away my joy. And earlier on, and I've been writing about living with HIV about as long as I've been living with HIV, I had my sense of humor. And what I didn't see, particularly in the first 20 years or so, were people writing with a sense of humor about living with HIV and what it meant. I mean, we've always had that. You can go back as far as, Diseased Pariah News, the newsletter, to see that people with HIV have always had a sense of humor. But I wanted to bring out that to the surface. And so I think that's where I found my voice and kind of my niche. But I would encourage anybody to do it. And as soon as you start talking about I am all this or that, my imposter syndrome, starts striking in, and I'm thinking, I don't know about, I think all I've done is stay true to myself and written. I am a guy with HIV and a keyboard. That's who I am. And I have an opinion. And there is a certain shamelessness about that. But as I often say, I've been taught by the HIV community to live without shame.
Yeah.
And so I am going to be a little shameless about myself and kind of spreading my sense of joy about it, but also calling people out and getting angry when it's called for. Yeah. So how did I do that? I just wrote and wrote and wrote and spilled it out and tried to remain teachable and figured out when I was wrong and kept going forward.
So coming back to discrimination and stigma, how, I mean, obviously through humor, through sheer bloody mindedness, you've walked through that, if you like. You've walked through the valley of the shadow of death, to borrow the Psalms. But how did discrimination and stigma affect you outside stigma and discrimination?
I think most of it was thrown on myself, especially, it depends on what era of HIV you want to talk about. But if I look at the 80s, I was diagnosed on March 15th is when I got my test results, the Ides of March. Hey, that's coming up, isn't it?
It is.
In 1985, just a couple of weeks after the test was made available. And the next 10 years was spent Well, watching friends die and doing that whole, routine between, hospital rooms and memorial services and all of that. And those of us who were there remember what that's like. And those of us who weren't there, I'm always happy to tell the story. Um, but in terms of stigma, a lot of that was placed on myself. You see enough evangelists on the TV set saying, well, see, we told you. Look at them. Who's getting it? Who's dying from it? See? And even for a guy that tried to reject organized religion by then, a lot of it seeped through.
Yeah.
And a lot of it told me, maybe they're right. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am God damned. Maybe I am. Maybe everything I heard from the pulpits growing up as a Southern Methodist, maybe they were right. And so you can't escape a little piece of that. And so I think a lot of that stigma was on myself. A lot of people had it worse. A lot of people were, I lived in West Hollywood in the 80s when all of this was going on, living with HIV. I had gay friends who were kicked out by their gay roommates. It wasn't just limited to the conservatives. Everybody was freaked out. You couldn't get a manicure in West Hollywood. So, I people had it worse. I put a lot of it on myself.
Yeah.
I didn't feel worthy.
Yeah. And I think that is true for so many. I think, and certainly for myself. There is an African American activist that you and I both know very well, Ace Robinson, and he talks about the continued discrimination by primarily white leaders of the AIDS movement against the people most directly affected by HIV, primarily people of color. And I was really interested on how you respond to that. I mean, for me, it's a very, very personal issue. You may recall I used to run the Pangea Global AIDS Foundation. It was a Bay Area-based global AIDS think tank. And we just got to the point where it was just not morally, let alone financially, just not morally feasible to justify the continued existence of a headquarters in the San Francisco Bay Area, albeit in Oakland. And so we rightly, I think, handed the leadership, passed the baton on, if you like, to the Pangea Zimbabwe AIDS Trust for Southern Africa, and to the amazing AIDS Care China that has expanded dramatically across Southeast Asia. But ultimately, for me, this was about building solidarity. And I think one of the things that you have done, even when there are arguments that seem to divide us in the AIDS movement, early attitudes to PrEP might be one such example, but where you have been so clear about the need to build solidarity. And I wonder what your thoughts are as it relates to building up the next generation of leaders from communities of color in the AIDS response.
Well, gosh, that's a lot. And let me start with Ace. Let me amplify what he said. And basically, to paraphrase that, we got a racism problem even within the HIV community. And to me, it reflects on power and on who has a seat at the table and all of that stuff, which all sounds kind of high concept, but this is how it plays out. When HIV happened, a lot of white gay men, cisgender white gay men, entered the arena and said, we got to do something about this. And we pushed aside the healthcare, the public health people who were heterosexual and didn't know what they were, didn't understand us, and said, make room for us. And because we need to broaden this and we need to do things that reflect our own needs. And we did really estimable things. We did wonderful things. We built organizations and built a response, and that was all great. And then, it's not as if Black men and women weren't there around there somewhere. We just weren't paying a lot of attention to them. And why? Because we're innately racist. And then as those black organizations and those black potential leaders stepped up, who was in power? Us. And we were like, oh no, we got this. Mm. We became the paternalistic people that we had tried to move aside so that we could be in a position of power. And we played the same game as the struggle that we had had, but apparently we're better at it because we continue to be in positions of power all these years later. And, I got to claim my privilege. I got to do it every day. I got to think about what it really means in terms of how I've behaved over those years, how I've been paternalistic or dismissive. I remember being on a Ryan White planning council, that was distributing funds on a county level and looking at black organizations with leaders who were not as well educated as others and going, well, who should get the money? Who could manage it best? I remember having that, and I would say to myself, I'm not racist. I'm just trying to do what's best for these funds. I mean, I have to claim that thought process. When was that? 25 years ago or whatever. And as I've grown into maturity and as I've grown into working alongside black men and women, trans men and women, the things change. But boy, is it hard. And I can't, why it is, you see a lot of videos with, especially during the last year with Black Lives Matter saying, just be grateful that we're not asking for everything we deserve.
Yeah.
Just be grateful that we're not as angry as we should be. So there we go. I think that Ace is right in terms of there being an innate racism within HIV organizations. And a lot of us just still aren't ready to let go of the power that comes with what we fought for ourselves.
Yeah. And we just have to. And it's certainly something I want to be coming back to. And I'd certainly love to have further conversations with you about, what our responsibility is in owning this, as well as supporting people coming up through the ranks. And my gosh, there are some incredible leaders, men, women.
And let's have that conversation now, Ben, really quickly. And because I should say, yes, here we are, two gay white men, talking about this, and I go through this all the time. Do I use my platform to talk about black men and women, or do I hand them the mic? What's the difference? And to me, the difference is I try to take opportunities to let my fellow advocates of color and women speak for themselves. And what does that mean? Turning over my platform to them, highlighting them. I remember getting jobs when I didn't have a master's degree in this or that, but I was running educational programs because it was lived experience. Yeah. Because I knew what I was doing. I was working in, and we need to be giving, giving our black, they've got the lived experience that I can't, so giving opportunities, the same opportunities that we had,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm on the board of two organizations in the Bay Area, CalPEP, California Prostitutes Education Project, which is, I guess, the main HIV testing organization in the East Bay in Oakland. That is very much an African-American-led organization. My fellow board members and the senior staff are very clear that I'm there to help them raise money, punto. Mm-hmm. And that is fine. The other organization is the San Francisco Community Health Center, a federally qualified health center that, provides services to people of color, trans communities. And, I think the biggest contribution I can make there is just shut up. And, how can I be helpful? You have, you've reported from many countries around the world. And I confess, you and I have some wonderful selfies that I took from AIDS conferences in Melbourne and Durban and other places. But how have you seen stigma and discrimination and stigma take hold in different shapes in different cultures?
Well, we've been at those conferences. And so we see it with our own eyes, don't we? I generally go to the pre-conference, the MSM, Men Who Have Sex with Men pre-conference that was put on by MSMGF, who is now Impact Global, right? And to speak to that population, with whom I most closely relate, right? The other gay men are men who have sex with, but to see the enormous difference in terms of there are men there from countries that are risking their lives to show up, who are there, under false pretenses or having to convince employers to let them go and pretend it's something else, or, and they're not going to that gay thing, because they're literally risking their lives. And it's a humbling. I'm not sure what to say about it other than how incredibly humbling it is. I've done video reports from those meetings in which I have a variety of people, and of course the guys from Amsterdam and Australia are like, yay, we're gay, and then there are others who are from that cannot and are not, and those are the ones that agreed to speak to me, even speak to me, much less on camera. Some would speak to me, and some wouldn't even speak to me at all because they couldn't. It's just it's a humbling thing.
I'd love to share with you a story of my own from the mid-90s when I started working internationally on the AIDS response. We were in a southern African country, which will remain anonymous, and I thought I was being particularly brilliant in arranging to meet very confidentially an emerging gay group to see if the organization I was working for then, Positive Action, could fund them or support them in a way. And I was amazed, and to this day I'm still shocked about the very polite but quizzical response that I got. Why would I want to fund a gay group to do HIV testing and care support? Did I not know that HIV does not infect men who have sex with men? It's a disease that affects straight people. And yes, that is really shocking. But I realized in very stark terms that I was in no position to impose my values on them and say, no, you're wrong. The only role I had to play was to help them access information that they then digested. And, and I'm not saying in 1996 that they weren't wrong. I have no idea. But I do recognize that a community organization with no bank account suddenly receiving international funding and attention could put them potentially at very serious exposure and risk. And that's why I think groups like Frontline AIDS, formerly the International AIDS Alliance, do such an important job in sort of building community and building access to information in ways that are appropriate and don't put people at risk. So I'm so glad you raised that. But in your travels, were there examples of fighting stigma and discrimination that really stood out to you, and you thought, yeah, this is something I can really take with me?
Oh, gee whiz. There are a couple of African countries that will remain nameless, there's no particular example that springs to mind. There are people I know that are here in the States doing public health and HIV work that can't go home, that are living one extended, not citizenship, but like work period at a time, hoping not to have to be forced to the position of returning because they can't go back, because they're on the list. They've been identified as homosexual or working within the HIV field and trying to help other gay men, and they wouldn't be welcome home. Their physical safety would be at risk, and yet they're doing such amazing work here. And just hope that they can continue getting, work programs to stay.
Yeah.
That's everything that comes to mind.
Yeah. Oh, and that's where we have to be supporting them. Absolutely. And particularly with this new administration. Now, I wanted to talk more about cultural differences, and you know I'm going to ask this. Your review of a particular drama about the AIDS response in the UK in the 1980s, It's a Sin. It generated a lot of very heated, shall I say, responses from the other side of the Atlantic. Now, you didn't like the series, and that's all good and fine. But did those responses surprise you?
Um, the the intensity surprised me, and it's given me a lot to think about in terms of the intensity. I have a lot of activists, advocates on the other side of the pond that with whom I have great friendships and all of that, who were alarmed, who were hurt, who were troubled by this review. And I have to stand by. I do. Well, I'm like I say, I can always change my mind if I. But this was the series was a work of art. I had a response to it. It wasn't particularly positive, and and I said so. And it brings up a lot. I don't want to. And here's the thing: I want to discuss why the response was, but I don't want to then turn it on them and say, well, they didn't like my review because of the following reasons. They did not like my opinion of it, and they didn't agree with it. And it's as simple as that, and we could leave it right there. But there's a certain possessiveness about it, isn't there? There's a certain sense of, oh my God, they created something and it's about AIDS, and what if they never create another thing about AIDS again, and we have to like it? Or there's a certain amount of confirmation bias. Is that a word? Is that a scientific term? I hope so.
I would imagine
the
so,
idea that we can seek out things that confirm. In other words, we go in wanting to love it so much because, my God, it's our history. It's interesting. Gus Carnes, whom I adore, UK, who has really really resisted my review, shall we say, and he talks about it's a feeling. It may not have gotten all the facts right, or maybe it didn't. And let's remember, it's not a documentary, right? So, but he says it got the feeling right for him. Well, who am I to just disregard his feelings? If it brought back the feeling for him, okay, good. We need as much representation as we get. There will be another one. There will be another series, another movie, another painting, another book, and we need them all. I don't say people shouldn't go watch It's a Sin. I'm just saying it didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And I've outlined the reasons why. I just didn't think it worked. I didn't think it was ultimately very good.
Well, it resonated for me terribly. And just like Gus said, it opened up all sorts of wounds and memories I thought I had managed to put away. You mentioned Gus talking about this is what it felt like. And that's absolutely right. And, the levels of stigma and discrimination that were imposed upon us from the outside, as well as on ourselves from the inside, I think there is something really very peculiarly British about it. And, it's taking place when you've got this government, the Thatcher government, that is really antagonistic to the LGBT community. We have, at the time, next to no information about HIV, all trying to get as much as we can from New York and San Francisco. But I do understand why it makes no sense outside of that context. And particularly, this crazy society that since the 1980s has completely rewritten its approach to LGBT. Britain thinks of itself as one of the most tolerant. Just go back 20 years. That's when the dreadful Section 28, which prevented teachers from talking about homosexuality, that's when it finally got written off the books. It also reminds me of the way the British have completely rethought their role in building one of the biggest empires in the world. But you said something in your review that for me is really important, and if you don't mind, I'll just read it to you. It's a sin blames everything but HIV itself. Meanwhile, the virus keeps on replicating, right now, just as it did back then, utterly unconcerned with the judgments of humankind. And that's what, to me, that's so right. And it's what makes discrimination and stigma just so exhausting and unnecessary. But what do you think are the essential stories that you feel need to be told about the US experience still?
Racism. Oh boy, another series about white guys. Yeah, let's make sure we do another series about what it was like in New York. The South, Mississippi. What has it been like between the coasts? Those stories. We gotta make opportunities for those to happen. I want to go back to It's a Sin for just to say everything you just talked about. It was like It's a Sin was the spark for you, but everything you talked about, none of that was in the movie. It just inspired you to think about all of these other things and relate it to your own experience, and that's what art should do. So in that regard, It's a Sin was successful. It brought out stuff for you that made you think about all your other, I'm not immune to it. I'm not immune to the emotions that were in that series. You show me a plate of food left out of a hospital room, and I lose it. Because I was there. I remember what it was like. They put me in the full regalia, man. The suit, the gloves, the masks, just to go in to see my best friends.
Yeah.
I brought the tray, and I remember that. And it's a trigger, and I lose it.
Yeah.
But what are the stories that have yet to be told? The ones between the coasts, man. The ones that have to do with people, who are not making the decisions in Hollywood about what gets told. And so we have to find the platforms to do that. Something that's really front of mind for me right now is the fact that we are losing storytellers. We are losing the generation that was there. And I don't just mean the Larry Kramers and the Joseph Sonneborns. I'm talking about the Ron Simmons and the Mario Coopers and the black men and women who were on the front lines who never got to tell their story, who never got an HBO deal.
Right. The Gloria Locketts in Oakland, who spent 35 years building up that local AIDS response in the shadow of San Francisco. That story must be told.
Yes. Because we have to create that quilt of stories. No, nothing's going to be definitive. And It's a Sin, band played on, whatever they all are, they're going to eventually create a narrative that they're going to believe 50 years, 100 years from now. What is it? And in that quilt, is everybody covered? Well, no, they're not. And unfortunately, in the here and now, just like we're doing now, this podcast will live forever. It's digital. It'll be online. It'll be floating around somewhere, right? And hopefully you're going to take this podcast, when you're done or even now and make sure that it's included in an archive at some major university where they can, the students and historians can access it forever. I want to do that with My Fabulous Disease. I want to make sure that it's part of an archive that people can access. It was an archive that will be used for research or whatever. We got to make sure all our stories are told, and we have to encourage people whose stories haven't been told. Just pick up their phone and start talking into it and donate it to an archive that's doing that sort of work.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think the discipline of oral history. Recording and documenting is also one of the things in the last sort of 3 decades of the 20th century. It's one of major achievements, and it's one that technology, particularly in the age of COVID, has really enabled us to exploit. So I'm completely with you. Now changing tack a bit, and I realize we're coming up to the top of the hour. In researching this podcast, so I knew you had been on a game show. But the one thing I didn't know is that you had starred in TV commercials at the beginning of your career. You've done
I love
McDonald's.
first of all, I love how you say starred.
Oh.
It's like anyone who's done porn is a porn star. Anyone who's done a commercial starred a commercial.
Well,
So great.
you know, McDonald's, Denny's. But then
Yes.
this really, if you don't mind my saying, really rather unsettling thing called Golden Flake potato chips. It's just like, what the hell was that?
It was a Southern brand, okay? It was a Southern brand. Don't go get on don't get on our Golden Flake down in Alabama. We had them. Yes, I had a string of commercials because as a young man, an aspiring actor, I never took it very seriously, but I did look like Opie Taylor and Howdy Doody all rolled into one. And I had this all-American kind of red-haired, freckle-faced thing going on. I always said I was the asexual best friend of the hot guy in the commercial. That's who I was. And so I would do all of those fast food commercials. And I did it because I looked super young until I was about in my mid-20s, and then I kind of grew out of it, and I stopped. It was fun while it lasted, and I went on to AIDS work began about then, so life moved on. But yes, thank you for pointing that out. I hope that this is all because you were charmed by them. I was dorky but adorable.
Well,
So
I'll share something with you that not very many people know. At that very time, in a very peculiarly British way, I was a regular host on a British television series called Accompany that aired at midnight every night on the TV South channel, and it was the program, just before close down. And there may be a couple of tapes of this. If they are locked in a vault in a Geneva bank, never to see the light of day. And I only got 60
I have
pounds
a feeling,
per...
I don't know why. I think that you probably look like very flock of seagulls about that. Am I right?
Oh, and I was trying to look like the Human League,
Oh, yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Well, we've sort of come to the end. Have we missed anything? Is there anything that you feel our viewers and listeners really ought to know about you, about your work, and the issues that are really concerning you at the moment?
People are welcome to come visit me at My Fabulous Disease and see what damn thing I've said now, or turn it inward and find out if there's a story of yours that you haven't seen on the BBC or HBO, and that you want to make sure is chronicled, then absolutely seek out ways to do that via podcast, or write it down and submit it somewhere, or have a Zoom call with friends and tell them the story of what happened to you and record it. Because there's probably a historian or an archive someplace that would love to have it, and your story is worth telling.
Yeah, totally. How are you and your husband staying sane during this shelter in place? Any tips for our audience? Shows to binge watch?
I will tell. We skipped the making bread thing, and have really bored into Netflix and every other platform. Our cable bill is extremely high, but we're not going out to movies or dinner, so it all evens out. Fortunately, I am hunkered down with my favorite person, so I have a lot to be grateful for.
So any shows you're binge watching that you would recommend besides It's a Sin?
Oh, which I've seen every episode of. So I would say I've been watching Sex Education, really like that. Bridgerton is really great. You can always go back to any British baking show episode. You don't even have to watch them in order. They make you feel all yummy inside and are great sleeping aids.
Well, thank you, Mark. You are, without doubt, a shot in the arm.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks to Mark. Thanks to NewsDoc Media's Eric Espera, our producer and director. Thanks also to Sarah Anderson from the Bay Area Global Alliance. Bay Area Global Health Alliance, I should say, and Sean Howell, our executive producer. And thanks to Brian Regas, our program manager. And finally, thanks to you. If you have any questions or comments about this or indeed any of our shows, don't hesitate to contact us through Facebook and Twitter at Shot Arm Podcast. We'd love it if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts and give us 5 stars. It helps us get the word out. So have a great week and a safe week.